Okay, so today we're diving into something maybe a little unexpected. Feminist metaphysics.
Yeah, you don't always hear those two words together, do you?
Definitely
Yeah.
not something you'd typically see on a philosophy syllabus, right?
Right.
But for philosophers, thinking about the nature of reality, what exists, all those big questions, that's familiar territory.
Absolutely. Bread and butter.
But what we're going to see today is how bringing in a feminist perspective can totally shake things up, even in a field as seemingly abstract as metaphysics.
Yeah, it's not just adding on a new topic. It's like it challenges some of the core assumptions of the whole field.
Exactly. So where we're going to start is basically two main ways feminism really makes a difference for metaphysics.
Okay.
First, it brings in all these new questions, topics that, frankly, traditional metaphysics hasn't really grappled with.
Right. Things that are super relevant to, like actual lived experiences, social issues, political stuff, things that matter to people.
Exactly. So for a philosopher who might be wondering, why feminism? What's the point? This is where you start to see the connections.
Yeah, it's not just theory for theory's sake. It's connected to real world stuff.
Right. And the second thing, which is maybe even more radical, is that feminist insights, they kind of force us to rethink the methods and assumptions of metaphysics itself.
Yeah, like how we do metaphysics, what we take for granted when we're asking these big questions.
Yeah, and specifically identifying potential biases that might be baked into
Yeah.
like how we've historically approached these issues. And, spoiler alert, a lot of that bias is male bias.
Makes sense, right? The field's been dominated by men for centuries.
Exactly. So we should probably acknowledge the elephant in the room here, right?
Yeah,
A lot of people, when they hear feminism and metaphysics, they immediately think of sex and gender.
of course.
And I mean, those are huge topics, super important. But they're also covered really extensively in other places.
There's whole other entries in the encyclopedia just on those.
Exactly. So for our deep dive today, we're going to kind of set those aside and focus on some of the other really crucial contributions feminist thinkers have made to metaphysics.
Yeah, things that might be a little less obvious but are still really important.
Yeah. So we'll be talking about social construction, the idea of intersectionality, the metaphysics of social structures, and even, believe it or not, the metaphysics of pregnancy.
Like, what does it actually mean metaphysically to be pregnant?
Yeah, it's wild. And all of these, they provide these really new and interesting ways to look at things that might seem really straightforward on the surface.
Yeah, they make you question assumptions you didn't even know you had.
Totally.
Mhm.
So where should we start?
Well, social construction's probably a good place to begin, right?
Yeah, makes sense. It's a foundational idea in feminist thought, and feminist metaphysicians have really pushed philosophers to rethink what it even means for something to be real.
Yeah, like what we even mean when we say something's real.
And one of the first things they do is they make this distinction between the social construction of ideas or concepts
Yeah.
and the social construction of actual objects.
Which might sound kind of subtle, right?
Yeah.
But for metaphysics, it makes a huge difference because it's getting at the very nature of reality, like what's actually out there versus what's in our heads, so to speak.
Right, exactly. So let's take an example that a lot of philosophers are probably familiar with. The statement, sex is a social construct.
Okay.
Now, for a philosopher, that immediately raises all these questions like, okay, what kind of thing are we even talking about when we say sex?
Is it a property, an
Yeah.
object, a relation?
Right, right. And one way to understand this statement, this sex is a social construct idea, is that what's socially constructed is our idea of sex. Like the categories we use to understand biological differences, those are shaped by social practices.
Right. Things like how we label babies at birth, the language we use, even how science and medicine have developed over time. All that stuff influences how we think about sex.
Totally.
Yeah.
And even stuff that seems super objective, like scientific concepts. Well, philosophers got to remember, even those are developed through social processes, right? Like inquiry, validation, all that.
Yeah, there's always a social context, even in science.
Always. And this is crucial for philosophers, right? Because if we're trying to understand how our minds connect with the world, how we make sense of reality, we have to acknowledge that our concepts aren't just neutral mirrors reflecting some objective truth.
Yeah, they're shaped by all this other stuff, all this social baggage we bring to the table.
Right, and that opens up all these new questions. Like, okay, if our concepts aren't neutral, then what parts of reality are they highlighting?
And what are they hiding?
What assumptions are built into them that we might not even be aware of?
Yeah, like what are we not seeing because of how we're thinking about things?
Right, and this is where feminist metaphysics gets really interesting, because it starts to point out these blind spots, these places where our traditional ways of thinking have kind of let us down.
Yeah, and one of the big examples here is this idea of a binary sex framework.
Okay.
Like the idea that there are only two sexes, male and female, and that everyone fits neatly into one or the
This
other.
sounds obvious, right?
Yeah, it's like common sense. But then you have biologists like Anne Fausto Sterling showing that a lot of people are intersex. They have a mix of characteristics that we typically think of as male and female.
So our like default binary framework, it just doesn't capture that reality,
It erases it. It makes those people invisible.
which raises all these philosophical questions, right? Like,
Yeah.
why do we think about sex this way? Is there some like deeper reason, some practical purpose this binary framework serves?
Yeah, or is it just like an oversimplification that's become ingrained?
And once we acknowledge intersex people, how do we fix our understanding of sex?
Do we need more categories?
Do we redefine male and female?
What are the criteria we should even be using to make these categories?
These are all huge philosophical questions that traditional metaphysics hasn't really grappled with.
Yeah, it's like feminist metaphysics is forcing us to go back to the drawing board.
And it's important to remember that just because a concept is inadequate in some way doesn't mean it's completely wrong.
Right. This is where Elizabeth Anderson's work is helpful. She points out that a concept can be incomplete, misleading, biased in certain contexts, without being totally false.
Yeah, so it's not about throwing out everything we know, it's about being more careful, more nuanced.
Exactly. So that's social construction of ideas. Now, let's get to something maybe even more radical, even more mind-blowing for metaphysicians. Social construction of objects.
Okay, yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
So it's not just about saying that human-made things, like, a chair or a phone, those are socially constructed. That's pretty uncontroversial.
Yeah, obviously those wouldn't exist without humans making them.
But what feminist social constructionists are arguing is that things like social categories, women, Asian Americans, refugees, these are also, in a very real sense, socially constructed.
So it's not just physical objects, it's like categories, identities, even groups of people.
Yeah, and this gets right to the heart of social ontology. Like, what are these things? How do they exist?
And there are a couple of ways to think about how an object can be socially constructed. One is through social causation.
Yeah.
Like social factors actually causing something to be a certain way.
Right, like societal pressures might influence someone to become a doctor or a lawyer or, yeah, even a husband.
Yeah, but the kind of social construction that's really relevant for metaphysics is this idea of constitutive social construction.
Okay, what's that?
So this is the idea that being something, like being a husband, isn't just caused by social practices, but is actually constituted by them.
Like, you can't be a husband without the whole social institution of marriage.
Exactly. Without weddings, without the social norms and expectations around marriage, there's no such thing as a husband.
Interesting.
It's like think about money, a piece of paper that can exist without any social stuff going on. But it doesn't become money unless we collectively agree it has value, unless there are practices and institutions that make it function as currency.
Ah, I see.
Same with something like being a landlord. It's not about some inherent quality of the person, right? Like, you don't need a certain gene to be a landlord. It's about their position within a whole system of social and economic relations.
Tenants, property rights, all that.
Exactly. Without those, there's no such thing as a landlord. So it's the social role constituted by all that stuff that actually makes them a landlord.
So this constitutive social construction, is that what folks are saying about sex too?
Yeah, that's where things get really tricky and potentially controversial.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So obviously we know that our bodies can be physically altered by social stuff, right? Like gender-affirming surgeries. Those are a clear example.
Right, that's social factors causing physical changes.
But it's a much bigger claim to say that something like having certain chromosomes or a certain kind of reproductive system, that's actually constituted by social practices.
Yeah, that's a whole other level.
But that's what some feminist philosophers are arguing. They're saying that even just the act of deciding what counts as male or female anatomically, that's already loaded with social norms and expectations.
So like the very act of categorizing babies at birth, that's not neutral.
Right, and thinkers like Judith Butler, they point out that we do this for specific social reasons, often tied to reproduction, but we could, in theory, choose to categorize people based on other traits entirely.
Or not categorize them at birth at all.
Exactly. And Butler's argument is that by defining sex in this binary way that we do, we're already setting up all these norms and expectations about how people should be.
And then that gets tied to gender, right?
Of course. And in a society that's so invested in this binary gender system, where we insist that sex and gender have to align, then saying that sex is the natural basis for gender, well, that just reinforces the whole system.
But what if it's the other way around? What if gender actually comes first?
That's a fascinating argument.
Yeah, philosopher Asta makes this point that maybe society imposes this binary sex system onto a more complex biological reality because it needs that binary to justify the gender system that's already in place.
Like, we need the male-female distinction to make sense of man-woman.
Exactly. Asta says, and I love this quote, "Instead of sex being a natural category and gender the social significance of sex, sex is really a gendered category posited by us and claimed to be a natural one so that it can help perpetuate the gender game."
Whoa.
Right, it completely flips the script.
Yeah, like, it's not biology driving social stuff, it's social stuff shaping how we understand biology.
Exactly. And, as you can imagine, this has caused a lot of debate among feminist metaphysicians.
I bet.
Thinkers like Namaste, Prosser, Stone, they've all weighed in on this, offering different perspectives, critiques, nuances. It shows just how messy and complicated these seemingly basic categories of sex and gender actually are.
Yeah, and this leads us to another really important idea, the debunking project.
Yeah, what's that about?
So this kind of goes back to Simone de Beauvoir's famous line, "One is not born, but rather becomes woman."
Right, another classic.
And it's important to note, for philosophers who are worried about biological essentialism, that de Beauvoir wasn't saying there are no biological differences between people.
Right, it's not about denying biology.
Her point was that just because you have certain biological characteristics, that doesn't mean you're automatically destined for a particular social role.
Like, your biology doesn't determine your destiny.
Exactly. And de Beauvoir argued that a lot of times societies will assign roles, responsibilities, even create whole hierarchies based on these supposedly natural or biological features.
Yeah, like the whole idea that women are naturally more nurturing, so they should be the primary caregivers.
Right. And then these social arrangements get presented as natural, as inevitable, as if there's no other way to do things.
Which is super convenient for those in power, right? It's like, hey, it's not our fault, it's just nature.
Exactly. It completely hides the power dynamics at play. The fact that these are social choices, not biological destinies.
And feminists have done a ton of work to show how these categories, gender, race, class, how they're enforced, maintained through all these social practices, institutions, norms.
And they've shown that the links between our bodies and our social roles are way more flexible than we might think.
Yeah, like, there's no one-to-one mapping between biology and social destiny.
So the debunking project, for a philosopher, it's about showing that these categories we take for granted, they're not natural, they're not inevitable, and they definitely need justification.
We can't just appeal to nature or tradition to defend the status quo.
Exactly. Now, there's a really important point to clarify here,
Okay.
because sometimes philosophers get confused about what social construction means.
Yeah, it's easy to misunderstand.
Saying something is socially constructed doesn't mean it's not real.
Right. It's not like saying it's all just in our heads.
Most social constructionists are realists. They believe that things like money or nations or gender, these are real things. They have real effects in the world.
Yeah, they're not just illusions.
Right. As Asta puts it, the goal is to show that the constraints and enablements that are tied to these social categories, they don't come from some natural order. They're human-made, and that means they need to be justified.
Which is a big deal for ethics and politics. Right?
Huge. Now, there's this interesting counter-argument to the debunking project from thinkers like Louise Antony and the xenofeminists Laboria Cubonics.
Okay, what did they say?
So their point is that even if something is natural, that doesn't mean it's automatically good or just, or that we shouldn't try to change it.
Yeah, good point.
Antony uses the example of nearsightedness. It's a natural condition, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't wear glasses.
Right, or that we shouldn't strive for equal access to vision care.
And the Cubonics, they put it even more forcefully. They say, if nature is unjust, change nature.
I love that.
Right. Their argument is that we don't need to debunk something as socially constructed to challenge it, to demand justice.
Because even natural things can be unjust, and we should work to change them.
Exactly. So This raises an interesting question for feminist metaphysics. If we don't always need to debunk something, what's the point of talking about social construction?
Yeah, what work is it doing?
One answer is that it can be a powerful political slogan, like saying gender is a social construct. That can really get people thinking.
It's a way of saying, hey, this isn't fixed, we can change it.
Exactly. It opens up possibilities for social change.
And this leads us to Sally Haslanger's idea of ameliorative inquiry.
Okay, tell me about that.
So Haslanger says that when we're looking at social concepts like gender or race, we can do different kinds of analysis.
Okay.
We can look at the manifest concept, which is like our everyday understanding of the term.
Like what people on the street would say gender is?
Exactly. Or we can look at the operative concept, which is how the term is actually used in practice, like in our institutions, laws, social systems.
Okay.
But then there's this third kind of inquiry, ameliorative inquiry, where we ask, what concept should we be using?
Given our goals, our values, what's the best concept for understanding and addressing these issues?
Exactly. So Haslanger, she famously rephrases the question, what is gender, to what we want gender to be.
But it's not just about wishful thinking, right? It's
Yeah.
not just about, like, imagining some perfect future.
No, definitely not. And this is where philosopher Matthew Cull makes an important distinction. He says that Haslanger is primarily concerned with what he calls negative ameliorative critique.
Okay, what's that?
It's about figuring out the best concepts for understanding and criticizing existing forms of oppression.
So it's not about designing ideal concepts for a perfect world. It's about using concepts to analyze the world we actually live in, the injustices we're facing right now.
Exactly. And Haslanger's own work on gender and race, she defines them as hierarchical social structures. And those definitions are specifically designed to explain why inequality persists.
So it's not just abstract theory. It's trying to get at the root causes of social problems.
Absolutely. And whether you agree with her specific definitions or not, Haslanger's work has been super influential.
Yeah, she's really helped to kickstart this whole field of conceptual engineering.
Which is basically the idea that we can and should be actively working to improve the concepts we use.
Like we can design better concepts for thinking about and navigating the world.
Exactly. And feminist metaphysicians have really embraced this idea. We see ameliorative inquiry being used all over the place, not just with gender and race, but also with things like, how do we understand gender in a way that includes trans people? What's the nature of misogyny and sexism?
And even in fields like epistemology, relational autonomy, sexuality, disability studies.
It's really showing how philosophy can be relevant to all these different areas of life.
Totally. Okay, so let's move on to another big one. Intersectionality.
Oh, yeah. This is huge.
It's become such a buzzword, right?
It's everywhere.
But it's more than just a buzzword. It's a really powerful framework for understanding how power and oppression work, especially for philosophers who are interested in those things.
Absolutely. So the basic idea of intersectionality is that different forms of domination, race, gender, class, sexual orientation, disability, all of that, they're not separate and independent.
They all intersect, they influence each other.
Exactly. You can't just analyze one kind of oppression in isolation because they all work together.
It's like a web or like, well, an intersection.
Yeah, and even though the word intersectionality is relatively new, the idea behind it has been around for a long time.
Particularly in Black feminist thought.
Yeah, the Combahee River Collective, Gloria Anzaldúa, Cherie Moraga, even Sojourner Truth, way back in the 19th century, they were all talking about the ways race and gender and other forms of oppression are connected.
They were doing intersectionality before it had a name.
Exactly. But the person who really brought the term into the mainstream was Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar.
Oh, right, Crenshaw.
She was looking at why anti-discrimination laws in the U.S. weren't really protecting Black women.
And what did she find?
So the law at the time, it basically said you had to prove discrimination based on either race or sex, but not both.
So if you were a Black woman facing discrimination, you had to pick one.
Yeah, which meant that the specific discrimination that Black women face as Black women, that wasn't being addressed.
It was falling through the cracks.
Exactly. And Crenshaw, she used this brilliant metaphor of a traffic intersection.
Okay, I like this metaphor.
So she said, imagine an accident happens at an intersection. It could be caused by cars coming from any direction or even all of them at once.
Right.
And that's kind of like discrimination against Black women. It can come from racism, from sexism, or from this unique combination of both that's not just the sum of the parts.
So it's not just racism plus sexism, it's something else, something more.
Exactly. And Crenshaw later pointed out that even social movements, even groups fighting for equality, they can sometimes miss this.
How so?
By focusing too narrowly on either race or gender, they might end up leaving out the experiences of people at the intersections.
Like focusing on the experiences of white women or black men, but not black women.
Exactly. And that's why intersectionality is so important. It forces us to take a wider view, to see the full picture.
So for philosophers, what's the takeaway here?
Well, if we're trying to understand oppression, if we're trying to develop theories of justice, we can't ignore intersectionality.
Because if we do, our analyses are going to be incomplete, inaccurate, and they might even end up reinforcing the very systems of oppression we're trying to fight.
Exactly. And over time, intersectionality has become more than just a legal concept. It's now used in all kinds of fields.
It's like a lens for seeing the world, a way of approaching any issue.
Yeah, and it's been described as a method and a disposition, a heuristic and analytic tool.
Basically, a way of reminding ourselves that things are connected, that we can't just look at things in isolation.
Right. But it's important to remember that there's no one single definition of intersectionality that everyone agrees on.
Yeah, it's a complex concept, and there are different interpretations.
Some people, like Patricia Hill Collins, they distinguish between intersectionality as a lived experience and the matrix of domination as this bigger system of power.
Others use the term intersectionality for both.
And there are debates about whether the concept has been watered down or misused, whether it's lost its radical edge.
Right, like is it still as powerful as it was when it was first introduced?
Yeah, that's a good question. But for our purposes, from metaphysics, it's helpful to think about how Crenshaw herself framed it initially.
Okay.
She called it a heuristic term, which basically means a tool to guide our thinking.
Like a mental shortcut.
Kinda, yeah. And philosopher Anne Gary has called it a framework checker.
So something that helps us check our assumptions, make sure we're not missing anything important.
Exactly. And that's how intersectionality has really influenced feminist metaphysics. It's made us question the very categories of sex and gender, this idea of a unified women's experience, and so on.
It forces us to ask, whose experiences are we centering? Whose are we leaving out?
Right. And when we apply an intersectional lens to metaphysics, it leads to some really important claims.
Okay, like what?
Well, one is the idea of non-additivity.
Which is what?
It means that the oppression someone experiences at the intersection of multiple categories, it's not just the sum of the oppressions they face based on each category individually.
So it's not like racism plus sexism equals the experience of a black woman.
Right. It's more than that. It's something different.
And why is that important?
Well, because a purely additive approach, it tends to center the experiences of the most privileged members of oppressed groups.
Like if we're talking about sexism, but we're only thinking about white middle-class women, we're missing a huge part of the picture.
Exactly. And Crenshaw, she famously said, the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism.
I like that.
And then there's non-separability, which is closely related.
Okay, tell me about that one.
So non-separability means that the different forms of oppression someone faces, they can't be neatly separated out and attributed to different categories.
Like you can't say, oh, this part of their experience is due to their race and this part is due to their gender.
Right. It's all intertwined. You can't really separate them.
And why is that important?
Well, for one thing, it makes those either questions we were talking about earlier, those become meaningless.
Like asking whether a black woman was discriminated against because she's black or because she's a woman.
Yeah, those questions just don't make sense in an intersectional framework.
And it's not just that it's hard to separate these things out. It's that they really are interconnected. They reinforce each other.
Exactly. And then there's an even stronger claim, the idea of cross-constitution or mutual constitution.
Okay, what's that?
So this is the idea that categories like race and gender, they actually play a role in shaping and constructing each other.
Like gender wouldn't be what it is without race and vice versa.
Exactly. They're co-constitutive.
Wow.
And then there's this even more radical idea that intersectional kinds, categories like black woman, might actually be more fundamental than black and woman considered separately.
Like black woman is the real thing and black and woman are just abstractions from that.
That's the argument, yeah. And the idea is that understanding this intersectional category, that can actually give us a better understanding of both blackness and womanhood.
Interesting.
But it's important to note, Crenshaw herself has expressed some reservations about this claim, and it's still being debated.
But what's cool is that we're starting to see philosophers use the tools of analytic metaphysics to try to understand intersectionality.
Yeah, like Jorba and Rodozarate, they're suggesting that we should think about social categories as properties of individuals and social systems rather than as these separate objects.
And they argue that this leads to an emergentist view, where the experiences at the intersections have unique features that emerge from the interaction of different properties.
And they see this as supporting the idea of mutual constitution.
And then there's Sarah Bernstein, who's arguing for the metaphysical priority of intersectional categories.
So she's saying that Black woman exists on a more fundamental level than Black and woman.
And she also talks about explanatory priority, the idea that understanding Black womanhood can help us understand Blackness and womanhood better.
Exactly. So all of this is really new and exciting stuff in feminist metaphysics.
But there's this worry that maybe focusing on the metaphysics of intersectionality will take away from its political power.
Yeah, that's concern raised by Surma Bilge. Like, does studying the metaphysics of it make it less radical, less about social change?
And it's a valid point because metaphysics can be pretty abstract, and it's not always clear how it connects to real-world issues.
Right. Like, what are the practical implications of saying Black woman is metaphysically prior to Black and woman?
It's hard to say. But a feminist metaphysician might say that a deeper understanding of these things can actually inform political action, even if it's not immediately obvious how.
And they might also say that not all philosophy has to have direct political consequences.
Right, sometimes understanding is its own reward.
But it's definitely something to think about, this tension between abstract theory and practical action.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about how feminist metaphysics has approached the idea of social structures and social systems.
Okay, cool.
And here again, Sally Haslanger's work is super influential.
Always Haslanger.
Right. So Haslanger, she argues that if we want to understand things like sexism and racism, we need to look at them as embedded in these unjust and interlocking social structures.
So it's not just about individual bad actors, it's about the systems themselves.
Exactly. And this raises some big metaphysical questions.
Like what?
Well, what are these social structures?
Yeah, what are we even talking about?
What's the point of analyzing things this way?
What does it even mean for structures to be interlocking?
So many questions.
So many questions.
And Haslanger, she gives us this helpful way of thinking about the difference between social practices, social structures, and social systems.
Okay, I'm listening.
So she defines social practices as basically learned patterns of behavior that allow us to coordinate with each other.
Like the rules of the game.
Kind of, yeah. And these practices are based on shared meanings and values.
So like shaking hands when you meet someone, that's a social practice based on the idea that it's a polite way to greet someone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those practices, they give rise to social structures,
Yeah.
which are basically networks of social relations.
So like the relationship between a teacher and a student, that's a social structure.
Right, and that structure is constituted by all the practices around education.
Grading, lecturing, attending class, all that.
Yeah, and then you have social systems, which are the actual groups of people who are in those relationships.
So like this particular classroom, with you as the teacher and me as the student, that's a social system.
Exactly, and it instantiates the teacher-student structure.
Okay, I think I'm getting it.
So to go back to our earlier example, think about the practices around raising children.
Like feeding them, taking care of them, educating them.
Right, all those practices, they lead to specific social relations, like the parent-child relationship.
And the general form of that relationship, the rights and responsibilities that come with being a parent, that's the social structure.
Exactly. And then you have individual families, each with their own specific dynamics, but they all exemplify that same parent-child structure.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it's important to note that while Haslanger talks about all three of these practices, structures, systems, other philosophers might focus on just one or two.
Right, like different levels of analysis.
So, for example, Catherine Ritchie, she focuses mainly on social structures. She describes them as complexes, networks, or lattice works of relations.